Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Science School Muscle podcast. I haven't been here for a while, but I have today with me a very special guest, Gary McGowan. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me, Marco. My pleasure.
I do hope that I pronounce your name correctly, because I have this thing with names that I'm always afraid not to pronounce them the right way. So.
That was pretty good. It's a bit more like McGowan, but you said
okay.
McGowan. But I mean, a lot of people say that here in Ireland too, so it's completely
fine. Great. So, I don't know, would you like to introduce yourself? I think you would do a better job than I would to our audience.
Yeah, so my name is Gary McGowan, as Marco said, and I'm from Ireland, from a part of Ireland called Kerry. So that's in the southwest of Ireland, so a relatively rural part of the country. So not a big city guy or anything like that. But I'm actually a trainer first and foremost. Like that's my main thing is that I'm a co-owner of a business or company called TriageMethod, and we're basically a health and fitness coaching and education company. So that's basically what I do from a work perspective. Is I help people from a coaching perspective with their health and fitness goals, and we put out a lot of educational content and stuff like that. And I do have a background in physiotherapy. I studied physiotherapy previously, and I'm a current medical student. So very much a lifelong student alongside that. But yeah, that's me. I'm interested in all things related to health and exercise and nutrition, and I love training myself. And yeah, they're all my main interests, I guess.
That's great. We will dive deep into your education platform very soon, because that's something that I would like to discuss with you. But I usually tend to start with like some general questions that maybe about your life in general. So we were just discussing about the COVID situation. Of course, it's making everything difficult for everyone, and it's actually getting worse here. So I'm afraid gym might close very soon again. So how is his life over there? And how you're doing with this pandemic?
Yeah, it's funny you ask today, because today the whole country is basically waiting on the next announcement from the government. They're about to announce whether or not we'll move to the next level or the next level after that of restrictions. So with that said, like yourself, Ireland is getting worse in terms of cases, and following on from that in terms of hospitalizations and deaths again. So it is looking like we're taking an uptick in terms of COVID again. So reflecting kind of where we were months ago, which is kind of, I think it's a lot tougher for people this time around, because initially, not that it was a novelty in a positive sense, but there was a lot of uncertainty going on. You know, people were really unsure of what was happening. The cases were rising very rapidly. I remember, like here in Ireland, we were hearing a lot about what was going on in Italy, and we were thinking, oh my God, you know, we don't want to end up with that type of situation. So I think everyone was very much in a position of solidarity with each other, you know, and then as we came out of that and things started to open up again, I think everyone was feeling pretty positive. You know, we were able to go to the gym, and we were back training jujitsu, and you know, everyone could go to the pubs or the restaurants again, and things were looking very promising over the summer. But then, you know, that kind of did come crashing down a little bit recently, and we're basically back to moving up the levels of restriction. So I think this time around, particularly as we head into the winter, people are having a much tougher time dealing with it, particularly because I think there's a lot of division among the general public as well. I always say that I wouldn't like to be a politician for this reason, because you've basically got 50% of people who want the country to be locked down as much as possible, and you know, everyone to be protected and put away, no exposures. And then you've got the other 50% who are saying, open up the country, most of us are at low risk, you're all being tyrannical, so you basically just can't win. Like, so I'm not in either direction, to be honest. I'm just thinking that this is a hard decision for anyone to have to make. Mm-hmm. But personally, in terms of my own life, I can't complain too much. I work online. You know, I have opportunities to have chats like this with yourself. It's not affected by COVID, and I'm able to do all of my studies and everything online. So the only thing really that is affected from my perspective is the ability to go to the gym or to train jujitsu. And I mean, but other than that, you know, I'm able to do my studies as normal. All of our content is available online. Obviously, we have less contact hours in college, which is a little bit of a downside, but I mean, it's not the end of the world either. So for me personally, I'm not too stressed about COVID at this point in time. Obviously, it's a privilege to be able to say that I'm not too concerned about my own risk either. Obviously, there are cases of young, healthy people who are affected badly by COVID, but their overall risk is obviously a lot lower. But that doesn't change the fact that I have to be vigilant about, transferring it to my parents or grandparents or whatever. So yeah, that's me. I think the rest of the recording probably would have got the Ireland situation in general. But
I think I will be able to recover it, because I saw already in the chat that the load is available. So hopefully it will just take a little bit of time to put it back together. So do you think, first of all, were you expecting that things would get worse again when we sort of got out of lockdown? And did we maybe transition into sort of quote unquote normal life too soon, too quickly? And maybe the process should have been a little bit more steady, and with taking off restrictions as we moved forward.
Yeah, I'm not sure, because I'm not even sure like what the right solution is, and that's something I was saying to you before we got on the call, is that like I wouldn't like to be the person trying to make these decisions, and they're really difficult decisions to make, to say how much freedom people should have, because obviously as soon as you start to take freedoms and rights, you could say, away from people, some people are going to get quite frustrated about that, and the behavior is not going to be homogenous in the population, in that young people are probably going to be less worried about it. And if you're in college and you're an 18-year-old student, you're probably going to go to house parties and not think too much of it, So I think it was inevitable that once schools reopened and colleges started again, and as a result students congregated together for house parties, etc., that we would see more cases rising again. Whether or not we did that too quickly, I think, well, the proof is in the pudding, really. If we're saying that things are getting worse, clearly it wasn't the best way of doing things. But again, I don't really know what the best way of doing things is at this point. I'm no public health expert.
And at some point you mentioned that you personally, and I can say the same for me, I honestly, not that I enjoyed the lockdown, but it really got me back on track. Like I think last month I got a little bit off track with doing the stuff, study, and really lockdown made me realize how much time in the day we have that we tend to waste on social media or watching YouTube and so on. And when you're forced to stay at home, I don't know if it's the same for you and you can relate to that, but I really realized, okay, wow, so many hours that I can do productive things that I was just wasting up to this point. Did you have that feeling?
Yeah, I'd actually completely agree with you, because I suppose normally when I'm in college and I'm also working online, my day ends up being quite fragmented, in the sense that, when you're in college and you have a class, let's say, and before the class, you're on your way to the class, obviously, or you're meeting with friends and you're walking to the class, and then you might have an hour off between classes, and you're not going to go and get a productive hour of work done very often. You might go and get a coffee and you're sitting with friends for a while, and those types of things. And even commuting in and out of college, again, is more time. And if I'm training jujitsu, normally I'll get a bus and then I'll walk, and then afterwards I'll get a lift home. So all these things actually take up so much of my day, and when I have them free, it's like, wow, there's actually so many hours in the day that I could be very productive with. And obviously the tendency then is to say, oh well, I have so much time, so I'll do that later. I'll do that later. And for me, one of the things I've gained out of lockdown is really being a lot stricter with scheduling my day. So when I wake up in the morning, opening up a to-do list and saying, this is what you have to do today. And because I have a lot of different things on there, I'm able to at least reason with myself a little bit and say, okay, I'll do this now, and then I'll do this after. And okay, I don't really feel like doing that now because that requires a lot of attention and I don't feel up to it. I'll do that this evening or something like that, So there's still a bit of flexibility, but definitely been a lot stricter with scheduling my day, because like you say, it's opened my mind up to, or my eyes up to, how much time there actually is in the day. And right now I'm probably in one of the most productive spells I'd say I've had, and lockdown is definitely a part of that. Not to say it's a good thing, but like you said, there are some positives to take from it.
Yeah, and I want to ask you if you've always been like that, and you kind of already answered that question, because you said, you took a step up probably after lockdown. But I read in your bio that you also played video games when you were younger, so
Yeah.
I suppose it wasn't always like that, and it's the same for me. And you're really someone that I told you that on Instagram several times, that I really look up to you in terms of wow, he gets so much done in his day. And he has such a clear idea of what he wants to achieve in the day. I think that's one of the things that prevents people from achieving what they want, is that sometimes they don't even know what they want. So it's always been like this for you, or at some point you realize how you want your day to look like, and what is it that you really want to achieve?
Yeah, no, I definitely wasn't always like this. Like you say, like when I was younger and I was, 15, 16, played a lot of video games, like anyone else. I wasn't this real hyper-productive, conscientious person who always had their shit together. Like that was not me at all. That emerged part out of necessity and part just out of being interested in what I'm doing and liking having a purpose in life. And that came over time. So for me, I initially, when I was just doing, this is what, I'm not sure if this is relatable, but I want to kind of put this forward because I think it's an interesting idea, and it's related to the concept of procrastination. And I think when someone only has, let's say, one thing to do, like let's say you're doing a final year project for college and you procrastinate on doing that. When you procrastinate on doing that, what do you actually replace it with? Very often it's video games or Netflix or something like that, So I'm not free of procrastination. I don't think anyone else is. But the difference is that, like I just mentioned there, as it relates to the to-do list, when I'm procrastinating, it's generally moving from one thing that is, would be considered a productive task that I don't really feel like doing right now, to another thing that is still a productive task. And like that might sound like, oh, look at this guy, he's just doesn't do anything bad. But it still comes from the same place of me saying, oh, I don't feel like doing that assignment right now, but I do have some emails I can do, so that'll make me feel a bit better, and it's a bit easier to do, so I'm going to do that now, Or even saying, I don't feel like doing much this morning. Oh, thank God I have this podcast with Marco. That's a bit easier to do. I'm going to enjoy that, So I think if you can actually start to, and this is definitely going off on a tangent from your question, but if you can kind of build a life in which when you are procrastinating, it's still useful, then that's a great life to have. Like if your form of procrastinating is reading a book for the purposes of education, or if your form of procrastinating is you going to the gym, again, that's excellent. What you don't want is for your procrastination to just be doing nothing, sitting around watching YouTube videos that have no substance. That's fine every now and then. But that's really, I think, been one of the biggest differences for me. And I think that that's not something that everyone can necessarily achieve. And because I'm basically working with Triage while also doing a fairly challenging degree. So as a result, I know I have a certain amount to do. So it's necessity that I have to get a certain amount done in the day, or else like you fall behind. That's it. It's as simple as that. Your clients aren't happy because you haven't done your work, and your grades are shit because you haven't done your study. So there is a necessity component to it as well. So I don't think it's anything inherent to me that makes me special or anything. It's just types of a way of living that I've developed over time because of necessity and because of my choices.
Something that really stuck with me is I think you know Jordan Peterson. I'm not sure how much you get exposed to his content, but something that he said is to take responsibility of our day, and we want to structure it in such a way that we achieve what moves us forward to moving life. And I think what you said really takes some responsibility for people, because if I start putting maybe lower priority tasks into things that like playing video games or watching the new YouTube video, yes, I am, I'm not procrastinating, but those are not really task that I should be doing. So I think because most time we think books on productivity, like emails, reading emails is like the one task that makes you feel like you're being productive, just because you keep procrastinating on the things that are more important. So I think there is a time in the day where I just need to get this done, and I really need to take my mind into it.
Yeah, and Jordan, like you said, Jordan Peterson, he actually heavily influenced my kind of perspective on scheduling and to-do lists in general, because I think you alluded to it there. But what he says in his discussions around scheduling is, he says, you know, like you say, treat yourself like someone you're responsible for looking after. But he also says that you don't want to build a day that you hate. That's not what the purpose of scheduling. So, you know, this is what people do on a Sunday evening when they're like, I'm going to have a perfect week. We obviously see it in nutrition as well, where someone will create the perfect meal plan, but they hate it. They're not going to stick to it. And it's the same with your life in general. If you schedule every single minute of your day and all of it is filled with things that you don't enjoy doing, like, sure, it might be productive, but it's not going to last. It is as simple as that. And that is why I'll always have on my to-do list, like it's literally here next to me, you know, read the books that I'm currently reading, read one chapter of this book, and, you know, get your training done. So it's the things that I actually enjoy as well, rather than just the things that I don't enjoy. Because if you don't make time for those things, that's a great way to become an unhappy person. And that increases in importance the further you get away from the things that you enjoy. So I really enjoy my degree. I really enjoy my work. Of course, there are elements I don't like, but that means that I have less of a need, to be honest, for the kind of free leisure time that some people feel they really need. But if you have a job that you hate from 9 to 5, there's no point scheduling in from 5 to 9 more things that you hate. You're already doing that, you know. So you do have to be kind of a little bit kind to yourself as well.
Yeah, it has to be reasonable in some capacity, because it's not like you just sent an email, I think today, on the mailing list of Triage, where you said like people just make up plans that they're not going to stick to. And something that I really notice into people is that they go from 0 to 100, or at least they want to go from 0 to 100, and they just finish the fuel within 2 days. So rather than go to 0 to 10 to 20 maybe, and keep going. So what I'm interested in, just getting back a little bit into the COVID situation, did you deal with clients that struggled more mentally than physically throughout the lockdown? Because I have, and I would like to know if you had some honest conversation about the fact that maybe some people don't have limited equipment. I had clients that need to train while their mom passes by or is cooking in the kitchen. So it was just an unexpected and unprecedented situation. And how did you deal, if you had to deal with those things?
Yeah, like there were a lot of difficult situations, and like you say, everyone is in their own situation too. You know, I think, and I think even just because as an online coach, you're dealing with people who have the disposable income to pay for coaching, number one, and two, enough of an interest to seek out a coach. We're already dealing with outliers who are probably more likely to stay on track with their health and fitness throughout the COVID situation. So I can only imagine how other people are feeling. You know, if you've just gotten into the gym and suddenly this happens, that's obviously more difficult. But in terms of like my own client situations, yes, there were some people, of course, who were just like, yeah, this is no factor. I'm going to buy some dumbbells and just stay on track, and that's not a problem. I'll get my workouts in, write me up the workouts, I'll do them. Cool, no problem. Others had a far more difficult time. I think once the first kind of 2 to 4 weeks had gone by, people were sick of doing push-ups. People were sick of doing bodyweight squats. You know, even my clients who had dumbbells and maybe a barbell at home, they were getting sick of the workouts that they were able to do. And I think it also exposed something for a lot of people who have never maybe worked at home or spent a lot of time at home, that being at home all the time and having work and training and leisure all in the same place can feel really shit. You know, it doesn't feel that great. And it's very easy when you're at home to say to yourself, oh yeah, I'll do a workout later. I'll go into the sitting room and I'll do a bit of exercise later. But what we don't realize is that there's so many rituals that surround our training normally, like the act of getting my gym bag ready, having a coffee, going out the door, driving to the gym. All of those things are part of the ritual that prepares you for the task. And if you're just saying, oh yeah, I'll go into the next room and do a bit of a workout, you know that you have your laptop there, you've got your phone there, there's other people in the house, there's many, many distractions. So I think a lot of people did struggle in terms of keeping on track with training, and also in terms of keeping on track with nutrition. If you're at home more often, a lot of people took up baking more often. If you're working in your kitchen, obviously there's food available all the time, you don't have scheduled lunch times, etc. There's constant temptation for snacking, and if your mood is already low and you're feeling anxious, of course that feeds in then to your feeding behavior. So in terms of addressing those things, from a training perspective, one of the main things that I tried to do was get my clients to still set goals, even if they weren't doing things that they would normally do. So for example, a lot of my clients took up a little bit more running. So we had a few running. And a lot of people have actually kept that up even as the gyms opened again. So if someone's able to run their first 5K or their first 10K or whatever it is, then that's a win. That's still a win. And even though it's not weight training, which is what a lot of my clients would do primarily, it's still progress that can be made. So if you're able to be working towards something while still keeping up your bit of weight training with your dumbbells at home and bodyweight exercises, I think that still feels good because you feel like you're moving in a positive direction. And that's really what it's all about with training, that, I'm working towards something. I'm not just doing it for the sake of it. A lot of people need that kind of sense that there's a purpose here, that I'm doing it for something. And in terms of nutrition, then I think that was a lot more challenging because it really is a case of saying, you do actually have to have some structure here. You have to say, I'm going to have my lunch at this time. That is my lunchtime, and if you are working, instead of working in the kitchen, let's work in a specific office if you can. If you don't have that, could you work in the sitting room, So lots of different things around nutrition. But yeah, to your question, a lot of people definitely did struggle, and I think that it's very justifiable.
Something that you mentioned was, and it's another thing that Jordan speaks about, is to not have the same work. The workplace shouldn't be your bedroom, which is a rule that I don't follow, unfortunately, because I have a large bedroom and, and my bed is just in front of me. But I do agree that we want to have this distinction about environments. Here's where I train, here's where I eat, here's where I sleep, and so on. And to that extent, most people told me, I don't have the motivation. So I would like to ask, what do you think about this phrase and about motivation in general? And do you think it's a thing, or we should not rely on that too much?
Yeah, motivation is always an interesting one. I like talking about it because I think there's this idea that people will message me or comment on my post or something and say, Gary, you're so motivated. How are you always so motivated? And they associate that with the feeling that you get when you watch a Gary Vaynerchuk video or a 5-minute excerpt from a Jordan Peterson video or whatever it happens to be. Because, you can go on YouTube and you can watch a video that gives you this big kick of inspiration, and that feeling that you get, people think that is going to last. And it's very often a Sunday evening and people are saying, I'm going to be on track for the week. I've got this feeling. But that feeling doesn't last, okay? So you're not gonna rise to that level of that feeling all the time. Rather, you're gonna basically fall more so to the level. It is a phrase. You don't rise to the level of your goals. You fall to your systems. But basically, you do fall to the level of your systems, and you fall to the level of your structure and your basic everyday habits, and that's what's really important ultimately. So in terms of motivation for me, am I a motivated person? Do I feel motivated regularly? I would say yes. I think that comes from feeling when I'm doing something and I'm saying, oh, here's the purpose why I'm doing this. That gives me that kind of brief feeling, but it's not always there. It's not always there, and it's not always going to be there. That's just not, I don't think that's something that you should expect. I think what you should be aiming towards is, if you can use that little boost of motivation to push you to put some basic habits in place and then work on those, then that's fantastic. But ultimately, you need to work to get to the point where there's lower resistance between you and completing the task. So for me, to go to the gym, there's very little resistance for me to go to the gym because I like going to the gym. I like how it makes me feel. I like how it makes me feel after. And I already understand at this point that any pain or suffering, you could say, that occurs during going to the gym, like, that it's worth it because I know it feels better. So that's not a big deal for me. Additionally, the gym is a big part of my identity. I see myself as someone who trains. So as a result, it would be stranger for me to not train, So again, that feeds into that cycle of not motivation, but just getting the thing done because it's just what I do, and that also kind of brings me to the concept of discipline as well, I suppose. And for me, I think discipline is something that is incredibly important. And again, these aren't very clear concepts, but what I think of is motivation is just like a feeling, and then discipline is basically there to keep you on track regardless of whether or not that feeling exists. So if you're able to be disciplined at the times when you don't want to do something, then you actually get more positive feelings coming out of that. And it's actually a bit of a feed forward cycle then. And one of the phrases that I like from Jocko Willink is discipline equals freedom. And it sounds counterintuitive at first, but the reality is that if you can be disciplined to get things done on a consistent basis, it does give you freedom, not only in time, in terms of you have more time to do things, but it also gives you this kind of a really solid feeling of reward that I did something that was worthwhile. Look at all these ticks on my to-do list. And that's actually motivating then, because you know that, one, you've proved to yourself that you can do it. So there's a self-efficacy component. And you've also proved to yourself that it feels good to get this stuff done. So the next time that you're feeling low on motivation and you have to discipline yourself, you might need to be as harsh on yourself. You might need that same level of discipline because hey, it actually feels good when I do this, so I'm going to do more of that thing. And if you never actually, have the discipline in the first place to get the thing done, you're never going to get that feeling. And as a result, you can't even begin that feed forward cycle, So a lot of it is about breaking the initial inertia of doing nothing, of not doing the thing. And once you can start to build up some consistency, you no longer need that feeling of motivation because it is a feed forward cycle. So that's the way I think of motivation. It's something that can get you started. It's something that you'll feel every now and then. It can be a bit of a kick up the arse when you need it, but it's definitely not what sustains you. What sustains you are your habits, your systems, and some discipline every now and then.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I mean, I figure that for me, I noticed that if I just train in the morning fasted, because I have to drive to Rome to where I train, because I decided to move to this larger gym, and that allows me to never skip a session. While if I was waiting till the afternoon, yes, it suits me better to study in the morning, but then I get to should have at least resistance, as you said, and training in the morning does allow I will be sitting at home for the whole day. It's just easier for me to study because I can study till late, and it just suits me easier. So thank you. Okay, I assume lots of commonality. Gary, can you?
Sorry,
I think you lost me.
It was just cut off a little bit there. I can hear you now.
Okay. So yeah, you mentioned lots of things that I found in the book by James Clear. So that helped me a lot. And talking about books, another thing that really amazed me about how conscious that you are with reading books. So question that I asked Lyndon in the past, and I know you're friends with him, so I'm very curious about how you're going to answer me. But from your degree and why changing some person as a human being.
It just cut out there in the middle again. Sorry, I heard up the start. You asked. You said that I'm friends with Lyndon. You were talking about reading books, and then at the end, I said my degree. Sorry.
Yeah, no worry. I mean, it's just you're just having some technicality issues today, so it's fine. And it mostly probably on my part, my bad. So, why do you read books, and why do you books, of course, that are not physiology and stuff? Why do you feel that important? And do you feel like they are changing you for the better, of course, as a human being?
Yes, absolutely. Like reading books has actually been one of the most life-changing things for me. And it's weird to say that, because I never thought that I'd kind of end up being that type of person, because like I know a lot of my friends who are prolific readers, or people I know who would be very keen readers. They kind of grew up like that, and they were the types of people that they always had a book in their hand when they were a child, or their parents really encouraging them to read. But that wasn't me. I actually never read a book as a child. I didn't read up until I think I was 21, which is literally 4 years ago, was when I started, maybe 20, was when I started to actually just buy books and start reading them purely for like both leisure and interest outside of a degree or education format. So up till then, I had never been a voluntary reader. Obviously, you have to read for school every now and then, but I was never a voluntary reader. And for me, it really has been kind of life-changing, because I've learned so much from reading, but a lot of it is having an appreciation for the fact that there's nothing new under the sun, effectively. If you can read books from 2,000 years ago, 200 years ago, 100 years ago, and you can find so many relevant questions and problems and situations to where we are today, whether it be personal or psychological or social, whatever it is. These things have all been discussed before, and that doesn't mean that I just read, history or anything like that. That's not it at all. But even if you read like fiction, like Dostoevsky, for example, or if you read philosophy, and I generally like reading in the area of philosophy, you'll just find so many interesting things that are relevant to the everyday. And what that kind of showed me was that just hanging around on social media and thinking that people are smart and that people have novel ideas, it's just a bit of a waste of time. Obviously every now and then you'll come across people who are quite interesting, but the reality is that the vast majority of the things that you're going to hear people discuss under an Instagram photo in their caption, especially if it's related to like some sort of question about how to be happy or how to live a good life, it's all been discussed before. It's been discussed thousands of years ago. And I think that was a big eye-opening experience for me. And another thing is just, I think when you read fiction, which is something that I initially didn't do and did more and more over time, you kind of get this perspective that Jordan Peterson calls of a meta real world. Like that although Dostoevsky's stories are not real, that they are meta real, because they're so rich and so relevant with all the characters that you can immediately relate them to different people that in your own life, or the trajectory of someone's life, or the problems of the human experience, etc. So yeah, I think there is a lot to be gained from reading, man. A lot.
Yeah. You've read Incerto, right? In the past, Incerto, you
yeah. It's actually here on my desk in front.
That's something that I plan on reading in the future. I read a little bit about him, and I was watching one of Taleb's talk that he gave at Google, and it really struck with me, because he said, if you want your book to be relevant in 10 years, write something about the past, like about 30 years ago. Because if it was relevant 30 years ago, it's likely, if it's relevant now, it's been written 3 years ago, it's going to be relevant in 20 years' time. And it's more or less what you said. Like most things are just, things that people have written about 20, 30 years ago, even more. We're not reinventing the wheel. Maybe we are giving a different interpretation of something, but it's definitely not completely new. So does reading change in some way how you see the world, like how you or even how you, because I've had this feeling sometimes that when I read something about maybe a behavior that I have, that allows me to have a different level of introspection that I've never. It's like someone tells me, look, you behave this way, you didn't notice. Did you have that feeling? And there is maybe something that comes to mind where that happened.
Yeah, and I think that's something that you generally refer to as a metacognition, the idea that we as humans have the capacity to think about thinking, and to be aware of to be aware of how we behave and to be aware of how we think about how we behave, you know? So all those things are really interesting and definitely are enriched by reading. And I think that has happened to me many, many times. And going back to the example of things being said in the past, what's been particularly striking is me thinking something about maybe my own behavior or why I behave in the world, and then seeing someone discuss it from 100 years ago and it being relevant to how I behave in the modern world. And I'm like, damn, man, that makes me really aware of the type of person that I am. And even like your own drives for doing things and the way that you rationalize things in your own head. And if you read the narrative that is delivered in books, in fiction books, for example, and you see someone thinking through the types of thought processes and rationalizing things in the same way that you do, it does give you that extra level of self-awareness to say that, oh, this is actually an inherently human thing. Other people are like this. What would someone say if they were to analyze my behavior? And I think all that stuff is very interesting and is definitely enriching. And obviously that's particularly the case if you read things, discussions around like psychology and philosophy and human behavior, obviously, even things like some of the behavioral economic stuff and cognitive biases, etc. I think all that can be really illuminating and make you feel like you're a bit of an idiot, you know.
I think one book that gave me this feeling was Thinking Fast and Slow. Like there are lots of cognitive bias that I didn't even realize were there. So of course your day is pretty, like your schedule is pretty busy, and something that you post on a story very recently, and it really made me think, is that people think that you can live this type of life without giving up on certain things and without making certain sacrifices. And I think people ask me, like a guy asked me a few days ago, like, doesn't stress you that you have this precise schedule of the whole day of the things you have to do, and you have so many things to do? And I said, it's like asking me if training very hard doesn't stress me. Of course it stresses me. It's necessary. It's something that I choose to do, and I'm aware it comes at a cost. So could you give some thought about what you said there, and maybe what made you click on that topic, if anyone asked you?
Yeah, this is probably something that I think about, if not talk about, on literally a daily basis, because it's one of those things that is very unrelatable to someone who doesn't live a similar life or choose voluntarily to live a similar life. And by that I mean that the vast majority of the time, like pretty much 7 days a week, that I'm either working or studying towards something or training. And all of that stuff can be seen by others to be something that you don't want to do, something that you want to get over with. And the idea for a lot of people would be, oh yeah, I can't wait till all this stuff is done so I can go and do my stuff in my free time. But if you give me a block of free time, I'm going to do one of those things, whether it be like reading up on a topic that I'm interested in, trying to find out something I don't know the answer to, learning more stuff about how the human body works, whatever it happens to be. They're the things that I'm drawn to in my spare time. And I think that this is something that I like to ask people when we kind of have these conversations. And it is, when you're alone and your mind is just wandering, where does your mind go? What do you start to think about? And for me, my mind goes back to the things that I would be doing if I was working or if I was studying. They're the types of things that I'm thinking about. So to me, that is at least a signal that and it's not in a stress sense, like, oh, you need to do this thing. I wonder about that. I wonder if there's any research on that. I'd actually like to know the answer to that. I don't know that, trying to figure out things in your head. And for me, if your mind is always going back to those types of thoughts, I think that's a very positive sign that you are on probably the right path. Okay. If you're coming home from your job and your last thought when you leave the job in the evening is, oh God, thank God that is done. Thank God that's done now. Or if you're at work and your mind isn't even there, you're just thinking about like what you're going to do that evening, what you're going to eat, what you're going to watch on Netflix. I think it's a very different situation. And I think if you are someone who's coming from having those types of cognitive processes, having your thoughts go in those directions. And it's very difficult to relate to someone who tells you that I actually want to work and study all the time. Like, that is literally what I want to do. That's what I enjoy doing. So it is very strange. And even speaking to people about it can be kind of difficult, because like what I always say to people close to me in my own personal life is that, like, I don't want the free time that you want. You know, I don't feel the same way about the free time. Like, it almost feels sometimes, and obviously it depends on what we're talking about, it almost feels like a bit of a burden to have to not do the things that I enjoy doing. And just because what you enjoy doing might be Netflix and what I enjoy doing might be studying or reading, they're both the same in terms of like what they represent in our minds. And I think that's something that is important. You know, I can't even remember your initial question, but I think that.
Oh, that's absolutely fine. That's why we're here. I mean, I had a kind of a rough idea of what I want to talk about, but then things come to mind. And something that I read on Igablagat stories a few weeks back, and I think actually Lane Norton told him this, was that in a few years, the man that you wanted to be and the man you've been will meet, and you better hope that they are the same person.
Yeah.
So, and I think that's very, you know, I doubt that phrase doesn't hit the nerve on people, because if you can't go back in time. You live the years that you live the way you live them.
Yeah, so I think that is a really profound thought, because that's something that like takes up a lot of space in my head every single day, because, you know, I have these ideas of like what I want to be, what I want to represent, not because, oh, this is the popular thing to do and everyone's going to like me and, you know, I'll have lots of money, but because I think that these are the ideals that I would like to live up to, so I want to project that into the future. Like, that's the whole idea, that if I see these as being virtues, as being things that are worth doing in life, then you want to project that into the future. And I think, like you said, the worst thing for me would be to look back in 5 years and for literally nothing to have changed, to just not have moved forward, not to have made any progress. Like that kind of terrifies me. So that's definitely a driving factor as well.
And there's a concept from James Clear's book that when he talks about behavior change, he suggests people to move from a goal-oriented behavior change to an identity-based behavior change. Like he says, think about the person you want to be, and then behave accordingly to that person. And that really helped me. I don't know if you have a similar kind of the idea about yourself, about who you want to be and what that takes in terms of behavior over time.
Yeah, absolutely. And like, I've read James Clear's book, I think twice, if not 3 times, just because it's a handy read, and the concepts are so clear and so brilliantly articulated. And that identity-based behavior changes is like, when he articulated it in the way that he did in the book, I was like, that's it. Like, that I didn't have it in words, but that's kind of what I would typically discuss with clients and what I have done ever since. And in terms of my own life, how I apply that, I absolutely do apply it in the way that you mentioned, that is this what you want to represent? Is this actually your identity? Would someone like the person I want to be behave in the way that you're currently behaving? And you're not always going to adhere to that. Like, you're not a robot. Like, that's the reality. Like, sometimes you go into the cupboard in the kitchen and there's a few biscuits there and you shouldn't have them, but you're going to have them. And it's like, that doesn't mean it has to tear your identity apart. It's just, oh yeah, you're human. That stuff happens. It's not a big deal. But yeah, I think the identity component is huge, because if you can see, when you start to feel or see that sort of dissonance or discordance between what you think you are and how you actually behave in the world, I think that's actually quite terrifying. Like, and I think it will be for most people. And this actually resonated with a lot of people. Like, I think last year or the year before, I did a series of Instagram posts titled like Puppet Life. And the idea being that they were just like these like little short stories of like a person's day. And the idea there was that you're a puppet, that you're a slave to your desires, that you're doing things just based on what is next, what feels easiest, what you should do. And I think like a lot of people really enjoy those posts. I was like, oh, this is kind of strange. But the reason that it brings true for people is because it causes you to reflect on your own life and say, what do I actually do every day? And I think if people did that and they were to look at their week, even in terms of like the time you spend on Instagram or the types of meals you eat on average, like most people in the population would probably be terrified if they were to look back in their day and say, Jesus, I do very little. You know, I don't do much to build the person that I would actually like to be. So I think if you can have that in your mind when you're trying to make decisions and you're trying to schedule your day or schedule your week or decide what you're going to do for the weekend, and ask yourself, what would the person that I want to be in 10 years, what would they do in this situation, or what's going to bring me towards that point? I think that can be terrifying, but in a good way, that it forces you to like Jordan Peterson says, to speak your being forward. And I just love that phrase, because ever since I heard him say that, the idea of speaking your being forward, it actually made so many even like religious concepts like so clear to me that had never been clear to me, because I grew up always as a kind of an atheistic type person. Like, yes, I'm a Catholic, I'm baptized, communion, etc. But when I was in my teens, I was that kind of rebel who was like, yeah, I'm not going to take communion, go away, I'm not going to church, that kind of thing, and thinking, oh, you're all stupid for thinking there's a God or thinking there's any value in religion. And when I heard Jordan talk about speaking your being forward, I was like, this actually makes a lot of sense. This is why people pray. They may not know it, but when you engage in prayer or you engage in confession or something like that, let's say, then what you're effectively saying as you pray is, this is what I want to happen in the future. I'm trying to speak my being forward in accordance with some sort of ideal. If you want to call that God, then so be it. But if you want to call it the person that you're going to be or hopefully be in 10 years, then that's another way to think about it. So that phrase of speaking your being forward has really, really hit me hard and stuck with me since.
So still on the topic of like reading and stuff, but switching a little bit on to something that is more fitness related. I think you wrote also about the concept, or maybe I like to call it the bandwagon of being evidence-based, because it looks like something that a community that everyone wants to be a part of, though doesn't want to go through the process of being evidence-based, or at least that's my feeling from the outside. Because I still don't feel like I'm evidence-based, and Greg Nuggles wrote a post about what it takes to be. So I would really like to know, to you, what it truly means to be evidence-based in the fitness realm.
Yeah, it's really hard, and that's what you just said there, is that it's a really hard thing to actually achieve, to turn around and say that I actually make all of my decisions based on the available evidence, because there's no way you've read all the available evidence, and you couldn't have. You absolutely could not have. And I think, like, when you hear someone like Greg Nuggles talk about the exercise science research, for example, like, you could ask him more or less any question about weight training, and he could almost tell you the all of the authors on the study relevant to the question that you asked, and I think that's an example of someone who's very clearly made an effort to try and really, really be evidence-based. But with that said, I don't think every trainer needs to do that. Like, I don't think that's what you need to strive for either. A lot of decisions can be made based on having an understanding of the basic principles, following people who do actually take the time to read all of this research and try and synthesize it for you and make it clear, etc. And then actually taking your client feedback, measuring progress, etc., and trying to move forward. That's ultimately the process of personal training. A lot of the time it's an iterative process. It's a process of trying something, seeing how it worked. If it didn't work, why didn't it work? That might involve consulting the evidence. It might involve asking another coach, and then moving forward again. But the whole idea of being evidence-based, as you say, it really just became more of a camp in recent years. Like, it's the idea that I want to identify with this group of people. So I call myself evidence-based because I follow Brad Schoenfeld and I follow Mike Israetel and I follow Eric Helms, etc. No disrespect to any of them. They're all brilliant. But you can't just say, oh yeah, I'm evidence-based because I follow people who call themselves evidence-based. And yeah, it just really became more of a label and more of a signaling mechanism than anything else. Because if you signal that you're evidence-based, I can probably guess your thoughts on the vast majority of topics. If I go onto your Instagram page, you're probably going to have posts about how, volume is the driver of hypertrophy, and you're going to have a post on why it's just calories that matter, and, macros don't matter. And it's kind of the same stuff, and it's just repeated over and over again. And when something becomes a signal like that, and when something becomes just a case of replicating the same memes, you could say, over and over again, based on information you've taken from a handful of people, I think you should just be wary of your own ability to decipher what is good and bad information at that point, because you actually are just like, if we say that, right, the low carb and ketogenic community, we could say a lot of them have ridiculous beliefs that are just not supported by the evidence. That doesn't mean that low carb or ketogenic diets are inherently bad. Absolutely not. They can be great, but there's a lot of communities that are very dogmatic. So if I, as an early career trainer, was to go and seek out information on the internet, I could fall into a camp of low carb thinkers, and because they all believe these things, I just start repeating these things. I start repeating all the same things that they repeat because that's what I think is the right thing to do. Or in a parallel universe, that same trainer falls into the circle of the evidence-based people and just starts repeating what they say. Either way, the person has not worked through the process of deciding what is good and bad information. They don't know how to do it from first principles. They're simply repeating things that they've heard other people say. And it's just by chance, or maybe they'd be more convinced that because they followed these people, that these people are actually telling them the truth, So yeah, to your point, evidence-based is to me, it's a signal. I don't think it's a bad thing to call yourself by any means. And it's definitely not a bad thing to try to live up to. If you want to live up to making your decisions and considering your body of knowledge and to be related directly to the available evidence, that's fantastic. But it's a hard thing to do, and I think a lot of the time it is just a group thing, a group signaling mechanism more than anything else.
Yeah, I think, and I'm guilty of this mistake in the past as well, but most often people, I feel, like regurgitate the thoughts of someone else, and they kind of hope that they can eradicate the credibility that those people have by saying the same things. Like, once I make the same claims that Gary does, since Gary's so smart, my own thoughts are going to be a byproduct of that and being smart as well. And it doesn't really work like that. Do you feel maybe skills that a trainer should have, and generally speaking in the fitness community, maybe more so about critical thinking, being able to recognize fallacies, having a scientific method, how the scientific method works, what an experiment is, what an hypothesis is. I still like. I come from a completely different background, computer science, where it's easy because here's the theorem, and if we agree on the axioms and on the logical rules that we can deduct things, here's the proof. I know you like physics a lot, and you also considered going to an engineer path at some point. And that's something that it's impossible in the fitness community, and I feel even in medicine, like we don't have proofs of things.
Oh.
We can make claims on a certain state of the world, given what we understand of it, with some maybe probability, but we need to take into account the population of it and so many other things. And do you think those would be better skills to give people, rather than say, here's a study that was published and so we do this?
Yeah, and I think you've gotten to something really important there. And the idea that, in things like computer science or mathematics or physics, like very often, like you said, you have certain axioms you agree on, you've got logical steps, and it's like, okay, here we go, here's the answer, boom, done, squared away, that's it. In biological sciences, it just doesn't work like that. It's not that clear. A lot of the time we're talking about things, especially as you move away from more and more basic things. So as you move up the levels where things are just more complex, like if you're talking about something like human health or cardiovascular disease, there's always going to be huge uncertainty in statements that are made. And it takes a massive body of evidence for someone to speak with certainty. And that's why I think it's one of the downsides of people, when you hear people say, oh, but the science says, and it's like, what do you mean by the science? Because I think if you speak to a member of the general population who doesn't have a background in science or doesn't have an understanding of a relevant field, let's say, you can kind of think that all scientists agree on this and it's a very clearly well understood topic and now it's a universal law. But that's just not how it works a lot of the time. A lot of the time it's more like if you read independent research papers, the paper generally goes like, there's a discussion section about the results and it will say, here are all of the things that could potentially explain the results that we've seen. And then you'll have a limitations section that will say, here are all the limitations. This study was only on 50 to 65-year-old males, or these participants were also on medications, or the exercise equipment that was available was limited to this, this, and this. So there's always huge limitations that limit your ability to be really certain about those conclusions. And I think if you're a personal trainer, I don't think you need to go through every independent research study to justify all your decisions. Absolutely not. But I think what you do need is that awareness of what the scientific method looks like. So understanding that when someone says the science, that you're thinking, I wonder what that actually means. What types of studies do we have to actually suggest this finding, for example? Like, is this based on 100 really rigorously controlled trials, or is it just this kind of one study that seems to suggest this thing, and both of those things could be thought of as the science, but what the science is actually very different. So you don't have to read all the papers, but having an understanding of what the scientific method looks like in terms of having a hypothesis, testing out the hypothesis with an experiment, rejecting it, or whatever it happens to be, that's actually a good way of just really basically starting to build up those scientific or those critical thinking skills. Because if you know roughly what the scientific method looks like, and you have an understanding of the concepts like, let's say, falsifiability. So if I come up with some sort of theory, if I say to you, Marco, that I think that 40 sets per muscle group is the optimal amount per session, which is obviously absurd. But if I say that to you, then you can say, okay, Gary, well, what would we need to falsify that? And then I'd say, okay, well, I think that if we could get a study that tests 40 per muscle group, and then we have a group that is 30 and a group that is 20, and all those subjects have similar characteristics in terms of their age and their training experience, I would be happy to say that this is actually not true if the 20 group or the 30 group had superior outcomes to the 40 group. I would be happy that my theory or my hypothesis was incorrect. And even working through that thought process with all of your different beliefs that you have is really, really helpful. And even just asking a more basic question without going through those scientific steps of saying to yourself, how did I come to believe the things that I have come to believe? Like, for example, you'll see a lot of people in the weight training sphere saying, all you need is just one set to failure to get the best outcomes from your training, just one set to failure. And then you ask yourself, how did I come to believe this? And if it's just, I came to believe this because I had great results from this and I've seen other people have great results from this, that's actually not enough. Like, that might be enough to the lay person to say that, okay, we know that this thing works. But what you'd actually want is you'd want a controlled comparison of that exposure to more sets, let's say, and maybe further from failure. And then we can see how does this affect your outcomes? And we've got trials like that. And that can give you a more comprehensive understanding. And it can just allow you to say, you know what, I actually understand why I believed that. But when we control for other factors, it seems like this mightn't be the best approach. So maybe I can now try a similar trial on myself. And maybe this approach actually is best for you, which is fine. But at least you've done the work. You've done the thought work. You've actually said, why did I believe what I believed? So those types of different skills. And like you said, the awareness of cognitive biases and awareness of your own flaws in scientific thinking or critical thinking is just really important, because what we want to do fundamentally as humans is to have this clear explanation of how the world works. We want to think that we have a great amount of certainty about how things work. And the feeling of uncertainty and the feeling of saying, I don't know, particularly if it's a field of expertise for you, can be very difficult. It's not something that's very comfortable. Like, I don't want to turn around and say to my clients that I actually don't know the answer to your question about exercise, which I should know because I'm an exercise professional. It's really hard for people to do. So it's much easier for people to just double down and say, here's my beliefs, I'm not going to move from them. And when someone presents evidence to the contrary, you just say, oh, there's actually problems with that evidence. Whereas if you were an honest thinker, you'd say, I'm just trying to confirm my own biases here, okay? And I'm scrutinizing that evidence more than I would if it was evidence that supported my beliefs. And that awareness, again, that metacognition, that helps you to move to the next step. And I think a big part of that is not getting too attached to different groups or camps within the fitness industry, because that can really just be a parasite on your ability to think clearly. And you see that happen with so many smart people who, are clearly very clever people, but because they got attached to a certain group that all train the same way or all eat the same way, that they won't move from their position. And that's just, it's not a great place to be if you're someone who wants to seek out the truth or best practices.
Do you think social media makes it worse from this perspective? Because I think now with the ability that we have to connect to the people we want to connect, I think that's just fueling our confirmation bias, because I'm more likely to follow people that align with my own belief rather than consume the content of someone that says the complete opposite of what I believe to be true. And this just makes it worse over time, because I keep getting into this sphere where everyone thinks the same way, everyone behaves the same way, and everyone has the same logic. And I never get exposed to, because my exposure to different thoughts is just something that I try to avoid. So how can one stay unbiased in a world that makes us biased?
The first step, man, is actually that awareness. And I think from the perspective of someone like me or you who's having this conversation, who knows that these are problems, I think empathy is actually super, super important here, because I can completely appreciate how someone could go on the internet and end up believing that the earth is flat and that doctors are trying to kill them and that 5G is the problem. I completely understand how someone could end up there. You know why? Because the algorithms that social media platforms use are designed to do this. They will feed you more of what you view. So if I go on YouTube now, this happens actually weekly to me on YouTube, where because I like watching videos that I'm like, oh my God, this is so awful. Like I watched a video of some guy. He's like a carnivore guy who thinks that, it's all 5G is actually the problem and the COVID doesn't exist and the New World Order and all that sort of stuff. And I watched his video because I was like, man, this is amazing to watch him work through all these steps and genuinely believe this. I can't believe I can't understand what it would be like to be in that position. But then when I came out of the video, my recommendations on YouTube had all changed. Suddenly, I had these recommendations about the truth about radiation and all this sort of stuff. And I was like, shit, man, this is what happens to people. And if you're not someone who has any background in science, you don't know how to work through these problems, or you're not even aware that social media and other platforms, the internet in general, is doing this to you, then you think that you become part of this echo chamber where, oh, look, all these videos on this topic, this is all I'm being recommended. And suddenly you think that is the truth. So I completely appreciate how people fall into the trap. And I think step one is being aware that social media companies are trying to manipulate you. It doesn't mean that they're trying to do it necessarily always maliciously, but basically the algorithms are set up in such a way that to provide you more of what you like. And if you're constantly viewing things related to conspiracy theories, let's say, you're going to get more of that. And I think YouTube there's a lot of that on YouTube. I know that now there's more like fact checking coming into like Twitter and Facebook, and I think YouTube as well, and Instagram. You see these like bars down the bottom, or click this website for more information on this topic or something like that. But it's still a problem, and I can completely appreciate how people become really polarized politically, for example, really polarized in terms of conspiracy theories related to health and vaccines and everything like that. I don't think it's a good enough explanation to just say all these people are stupid, these people are dumb. I don't think that's the case. I think that we have an abundance of information available. I think that having the skills to be able to decipher the good from the bad is actually more challenging than people, appreciate. And I think that when you have like experts in the fields of at Twitter and Facebook and YouTube literally trying to figure out exactly how they can give you more of what you like and to manipulate you effectively, then how are you going to win that battle? It's a hard one. So awareness for me is step one. And then step two is obviously trying to foster those critical thinking skills and constantly questioning, how did I come to believe the things that I believe? Like, for example, if you believe that all doctors are genuinely trying to harm your health by prescribing you drugs, by prescribing statins or whatever it happens to be, think about the mass coordination across every medical school, across the millions of doctors or whatever across the planet. Like, imagine how hard it would be to orchestrate all of this. Could that really happen? Maybe, and of course there's problems with pharmaceutical companies. I won't deny that there's not some problems, but to assume that all of that is definitely a conspiracy, it's really difficult to come to that conclusion, and if you at least question it, I think you might start to see some holes in your thought process.
And you talked a lot about being aware of our own bias and knowledge and stuff. And I'm sure you're aware with the Dunning-Kruger effect. And I wonder if you ever been guilty of it while studying, like something like you study, I don't know, the nervous system and you say, oh, that's how fatigue works. Now I got it. Or biomechanics and you say, oh, now I get this. And how do you avoid it, or if it's avoidable?
Yeah, I think, firstly, absolutely yes. Have I ever felt that? Absolutely. I've definitely had to think back on things that I've said in the past and things that I've believed in the past and thought, oh my God, I'm such an idiot. And thought that, how did I believe that at the time? And I think once you've done that once, it's easier, because I can say that if I go into a new field of study, I better be aware that I'm going to encounter all of the problems that I encountered when I studied the previous subject or whatever it happens to be. And I think that's obviously nice that I've studied, so it enables me to see the same problems coming up over and over again, where you think you know everything at the beginning, you think you know way more, and then as you begin to learn more, you start to think, oh Jesus, there's so much I don't know, and I was so dumb in the past, because there's been times in the past where I've had different beliefs about different diets that when I think back, I'm like, oh my God, that's so stupid. And even beliefs around medicine, before I ever thought about going into medicine, having these ideas that certain drugs, just because I had heard about them, that all these drugs are really harmful, or that this test for this disease is actually just not useful. Doctors say that you should be worried about this, but you actually shouldn't. It's just not a problem. Because I just had this kind of just real loose, light, superficial knowledge that I had gained from maybe exposure to some stuff that I had seen online. So as I've had to reflect on that and feel the pain that comes with that, because it is painful, it is hard to reflect on your former self and say that only 3 years ago you had these beliefs and now you think those beliefs are ridiculous. It supports the development of intellectual humility, the humility in your own ignorance. And I think that is just so important. You don't want to be the arrogant person who thinks that they know everything, because it will hurt in the future. To begin to feel the pain related to that, it stops you from doing it in the future again, I think. So if you're someone who's maybe never felt that feeling where you've had to reflect on yourself, on your former beliefs, and call yourself an idiot, you obviously won't have experienced that pain. But just recognize that if you're new to a subject or to a given field, and particularly if you've no knowledge of that field, it's very, very, very unlikely that you have uncovered things that the experts aren't aware of. That doesn't mean that experts are always right, but it's just very, very unlikely that if someone has studied something for 20 years and you didn't even study it, that you've come along with the right solution. Those things happen every now and then, very rarely, and I think you should just assume that that's not the case.
So you said something about being superficial, a little bit loose. So I want to bring up something that I saw just yesterday. I don't know if you followed Alan Flanagan's stories.
Yes.
So you know where I'm going. But let's, without calling anybody out, but the thing is that I was talking about caloric deficit, and I think another issue that I see in the community is that it is about oversimplification of things. So I want to know your take on this, and if you think we oversimplify when we don't understand things. Like if you ask me something about physiology, I could reply to you, oh, that doesn't matter. But do I really know that, or I'm just replying to you that way so that I don't make myself look like I don't know?
Yeah, no, that's actually a really, really good point. Because I think there is a tendency, and I think it's quite popular to do that, to say, oh, that doesn't matter, don't worry about it, just worry about these things instead. And I think that's helpful sometimes. Like if someone is genuinely just asking a question that they're worried about all these like special supplements or whatever, and you're just saying like, man, don't worry about that, just focus on these things first. Like that's fine. But I think a lot of the time what we see is, someone will ask a very valid question about, let's say, nutrition science or something. They might say, hey, I've been changing my diet recently and I've cut out a lot of junk, but I see that my saturated fat is like 25% of my total calories. I'm eating a lot of steak. I'm eating a lot of butter. Should I be concerned? And then someone turns around and they say, oh, don't worry about that. It's just calories that matter. It's not a big deal. Like that is one, incorrect, and two, it shows just this kind of idea, or this meme level knowledge of just repeating the same old thing, like, oh, just be in a calorie deficit, just worry about that. That's all that matters. Whereas in fact, more things do matter. And I think the person who has gone a bit deeper into different subjects will be very clear on when these things matter. Like, I think that's something that you get. And it's funny that you bring up those stories from Alan. Like, watch or listen to any of Alan's content, or you read his articles, or look at his stories when he answers questions. He goes into levels of detail that a lot of people who talk about nutrition regularly probably didn't even realize existed, not just in terms of the specific answer to the question, but even the methodology of the studies that led to the answer for him, giving the answer to that question. And that's an example of someone who's like very clearly willing to give you the simple answer when the simple answer is justified, but also willing to show you that here are all these levels of uncertainty. Here's what the research actually says. And that's harder to do. It's much harder to do. So I think it is tempting, for sure, to give people the simplest answer possible. But the reality is that, giving people a complex answer isn't a bad thing. And I think just saying that, oh, this doesn't matter, I think that leads to a superficial level of knowledge that then proliferates among other trainers. And it can actually lead to the illusion of knowledge then, because if a trainer comes into the field and like that, related to physiology, let's say, someone asks them a question about training and they're like, oh yeah, just don't worry about that. Just do this thing instead. Whereas that question could have actually had a very sound basis in exercise physiology that this person could have discussed had they been aware of it. Then I don't think that's a good thing. And I think that people often mix this up, because if you listen to Professor Richard Feynman, one of the most legendary, not only physicists, but educators and philosophers of education, you could say, in terms of how he delivers information. And it's beautiful to listen to him discuss things, because he discusses the most complex things at so many different levels that you can actually follow along and you can get it. You just get it. And he always says things, to paraphrase him, that if you can't explain it in a single line, or you couldn't explain it to a fourth grader or whatever, that, you don't really understand it well enough. But I think people misapply that, because people misapply that to assume that you should only be able to explain it at that level. And I don't.
Stop at level one.
Yeah, like Feynman's point is that you should understand all of the details so well that you're able to simplify it. But you have to first understand you need to have the detail. You can't just repeat the end point and assume that you've achieved it. So I do think that is something that pops up as a problem. And exercise biomechanics is a good one, like you've said. I think a lot of trainers, if you were to actually if you were to ask them about some very basic exercise mechanics or even anatomy, which is a more fundamental subject, asking them about basic anatomy, like, oh, list the muscles around the shoulder joint or around the hip joint, people would struggle. And that, again, comes back to the idea that someone could ask them a question, should I do a squat to build my quads? And they'll say, squats the best exercise for the quads or whatever. But if you were to ask them, what are the names of the quad muscles? What are the muscles around there? What muscles are working during a squat? They're probably just repeating something that they've heard other people say, that you should squat for quads. And that might be fine a lot of the time until it's not, and then you don't have the knowledge base to come back to and derive an answer from first principles.
And then I think there is another problem, that is giving too much of a complex answer to someone who can't understand it.
Yes.
And I think sometimes that's done maliciously, in the sense that if I ask you something about physiology and you reply to me talking at the level of medicine school, of course I'm not going to be able to pick up on everything, and I will not even be able to figure out, is he telling me the truth, or is he just making things so complicated that I can't understand them?
Yeah, and you see, if anyone listened to Paul Saladino on Joe Rogan's podcast this week, for those who don't know, Paul Saladino is basically the carnivore guy, carnivore MD, and basically what he did was he went on Joe Rogan, and every time Joe asked him a question, he gave this roundabout answer with loads of unnecessary technical biochemical language that just didn't actually help. Like, I'm a big fan of someone using a large vocabulary and using technical terms as needed, particularly if you're talking to people who understand them. But like, he's doing that to flex, in a way, to hide the fact that what he's saying is actually not true. Like, that's the biggest problem there, is that, like, he's just a very significant bullshit vendor. But what he was doing was basically speaking in such a way that Joe couldn't even understand it. And he even said it in the podcast. He was like, I'm too stupid for this. I don't know what you're talking about. Because he'll just go back and forth and mention all these enzymes and mention the process of oxidative stress and talk about these specific nutrients and foods that no one knows about, no one's thinking about. So immediately it gives him this authority that I can't understand this person, so they're probably right. I'm just going to assume they're right because they're a doctor and they're talking in fancy language. Whereas if you actually had another expert on who was able to spar with that person to go back and forth, that's when you'd see the holes in the arguments start to come through. So I think that's one of the difficult things about direct to consumer information from, like, medical professionals, for example, because what they will do is they'll speak in a language that the public don't understand, that the public assume is true and is useful information. And I suppose social media has made that a relatively new thing, or at least a more common thing, where you can be a doctor or you could have a degree in biochemistry or whatever, and suddenly you have this platform on which you can put out all this information, and just because it sounds smart, people assume it's true, whereas those two things are definitely not the same.
Yeah. Did you watch the episode with Stephen Guyenet and
yes.
What's the name of the other guy?
Guyenet and Gary Taubes.
Oh, Gary McGowan. Okay, that wrote a lot of books, not very good books, I might add. So, I mean, that was a funny conversation because Stefan was making good points, backed up by research, and the other guy was just making stories up and to try to tell his narrative.
Yeah, and that's the thing, is that, like, that's another thing you need to be aware of, is not only the person who speaks in very technical language, but also the person who just tells stories and has a really nice narrative, and that can be nice to read. And I think when someone actually writes a really nice narrative, me and Paddy were just discussing this recently, like, if you can create a really nice narrative to and you use evidence to support it, unbelievable. That's brilliant. That's the best way to get your information across. Because an example there would be, if you listen to Stefan Guyenet on that podcast with Joe Rogan, although all of Stefan's points were true and were evidence-based, and he had done all of his work, and he's absolutely excellent, and his book is excellent, and all the information he puts out is excellent, his means of communication, that podcast, was perfectly fine for someone like me or you who are going to that podcast to see what specific points are being made. But to the general public who are kind of listening for infotainment, like, yeah, I want the information, but I want to be entertained, they're going to find Gary Tubbs more convincing because they're going to say, oh, that Stefan guy, he's real dry, or he seemed angry or confrontational. And the reality is that that doesn't persuade people as well as we would like. So you do have to be aware of those really nice narratives as well. And sometimes people will overuse analogies to explain things too, because a good analogy is fantastic, but if you only understand something or explain something at the level of analogy, that can often lead you astray as well, you know. So basically what I'm saying is that it's really, really, really hard for people to decipher the good from the bad, because not only do you have all the technical language to wrestle with and whether or not the person is presenting the information correctly, but you also have to deal with whether or not there's a good story and all of those factors. So it's not very hopeful, is it?
When you make content for the platform or for Instagram, I wonder if because there is this for some people there is this race to get a following. So everyone wants to do, like, everyone makes infographics, everyone wants to be believable, evidence-based, and so on. So, but what I get from you is that it looks to me, and tell me if I'm wrong, that you're more generally talking about things that you like and you want to make people like them. Like when you talk about anatomy, you don't want to make it sound like it's so difficult and such a complicated topic, like so out of reach for everyone. You really want to make anatomy comprehensible for people who did not study. So do you make the content for the audience, or do you make the content and then get an audience?
Yeah, so like you say, like my goal, or our goal, I would say, with Triage, like if you're talking about the anatomy content, let's say, so that's the coach's corner. If I'm talking about anatomy, I have to try and separate two things. So one is, how can I get the person at the other side of the screen to, one, see the purpose in anatomy, enjoy studying it, and actually get the information that's important. So that's the first part of it. And two, I have to separate it from Gary studying anatomy. Because me studying anatomy, I have to think about studying anatomy myself from the perspective of, so previously physiotherapy, obviously a very anatomy heavy degree, and now medicine, studying anatomy for the purpose of understanding disease, understanding really, really detailed things. And if you're obviously going to be a surgeon, you're being prepared to study anatomy again for a very, very important reason, that you need to know everything that is here if you're going to cut into a person. Very clearly that's important. But that's not the same for a personal trainer. So if I could very easily make the lectures in such a way that they're an hour and a half long talking about one joint, and it makes me sound really smart. And when I listen back, I'm like, oh, Gary, you sound so smart there. But it doesn't actually help the person at the other end of the screen. So it is trying to find this balance between all the factors that I discussed, where you're trying to get the information across, where there's enough technical language so that the person is actually conversant in the topic that they're studying, but also that they can see the relevance of where this fits into their practice. Because if you pick up an anatomy textbook, like if you ever have, they're very often quite bland. It's like, this is this, this is this, this is this, and very often they're designed for medical professionals, not designed for fitness professionals. So when I'm trying to make the anatomy lectures, what I'm thinking is, all right, how can I actually make this important or relevant, for personal trainers? So for example, as we were discussing the spine, like there's no benefit to me going off on a big tangent about the neuroanatomy of the spine and talking about all of the different tracts and all that sort of stuff in the spinal column, or in the spinal cord rather, because that's not helpful for personal trainers. They don't really need to know that. What a personal trainer needs to know is, okay, what muscles are in this area? What could potentially be injured by your client? What muscles are we training when we do a deadlift? Where do these muscles run? What's their function? What exercises work them? They're the types of things that are important. So for me, I have to ask myself, why are you creating the content in the way that you're creating it? And if you're just doing it to impress others, or so that you sound smart when you listen back, that's just not good enough, and that's fine short term, because if I was to put all that stuff out on social media and pretend I'm the smartest person in the world, I'm sure people would like it. I'm sure I'd get a following from it. But if it's not actually helping trainers, then I'm like, it's not really helping my target audience, particularly with the triage stuff anyway.
And you really, what you're creating there, it's something that I don't think there is anywhere else. maybe the muscle mentors, I know you're a friend with them, they have a similar platform, and I'm on them as well. It's really good. But do you think, like, right now we have such an easy availability of research reviews with Mass, with James Krieger, so it's getting, like, do you think there is an information overflow in some way, or could be? And could this be positive, or it also has some maybe downside or potential side effect on the community as a whole?
Yeah, I think there is a lot of information out there, and I think a lot of the thing that's difficult, I think, is that a lot of information mightn't actually be relevant to you as a personal trainer, and deciding what is relevant is really important. Because if you go on to any of the research reviews, let's say, like for example, Mass is monthly applications in strength sports. So very often what they discuss, and it's an absolutely excellent resource, don't get me wrong, but a lot of the time what they're focused on is, what are the best ways to gain muscle and strength? So you have to ask yourself, is this relevant for my client? Is this actually relevant for the clients that I'm coaching? And if there's a comparison, let's say, between a certain periodization model and another periodization model, that might be interesting for you as a trainee, but is it relevant for you as a trainer? And I think that's the stuff that people often don't think about. So I'm absolutely not knocking any of those resources, because they do have stuff that's excellent for trainers, for the general population too. But I think that's a lot of the information that is out there in the kind of bodybuilding sphere. Like if you're a trainer who's also interested just generally in building muscle and hypertrophy, you probably follow a lot of other trainers who are also into bodybuilding, and a lot of the stuff they talk about comes from that lens, because they look at the world through that lens of being a bodybuilder. So you have to start to figure out, what information is actually relevant, and that's what we're trying to achieve through the Coach's Corner, is effectively trying to make a platform that helps the trainer that is the average competent trainer in every gym. So people who work with a wide range of clients, from busy mothers to maybe some elderly people, to some people who maybe have other illnesses that could be affecting their life, and of course to people who are trying to build the most muscle they can. But we're not trying to frame it all through join the Coach's Corner to learn how to coach bodybuilders, because that's not the goal. And I think there is an overflow of information for sure. Deciding what is good and what is bad is very, very hard. It's definitely a challenge. But another thing is that your role as a trainer is fundamentally to help people. If you are a trainer, it is fundamentally to help people move towards their goals. And I think very often we blur the lines by trying to keep up with what everyone else is doing. So if the current trend in the fitness industry, let's say, is to talk about, training to failure, then we start doing loads of posts on training to failure. Whereas that's actually more for ourselves and impressing our peers than it is for, impressing on our clients or helping our clients get better results,
Yeah. So I don't know how much time you have left, because we've been going for a while. I mean, I tend to just when I like to hear.
You have another question or two? I'm cool. I'm fine.
Okay. So I have a few at more than an hour. I think people are going to like the more practical stuff. But honestly, the way I do podcasts is just exactly to have conversation like we had so far. It's the stuff that I enjoy the most. Like to talk to people that I find interesting and see their perspective and how they see things. But I have those are very specific and very direct questions, so I don't think it will take much of your time.
Yeah, go ahead.
So one is the one that I asked you on Instagram. I'm not sure about scapular positioning on dips. And I would like to add, if you feel there is difference in how we should position our torso or maybe scapular movement, if we're targeting more triceps, or people say I do dips for triceps with a closer grip, or we do dips for chest.
So I suppose the first part there is the scapular position. And I think when I was younger, what I used to do, or think I had to do, because it's kind of like a rule across all exercises, is just keep your scapula down and back, and that's what you do, because that's kind of what we probably cue people to do on most exercises. Pinch your shoulders back and down, that's what you do. But the problem with doing that on a dip is that you actually restrict your range of motion a little bit, because if your scapula are pinned back and down, then they don't have the freedom to move up into a little bit of elevation. And as your scapula move up into a little bit of elevation, so for listeners, that's just you shrugging up, your pec is also changing length. So it is actually involved technically in that movement, because as you elevate the scapulae up, the humerus, the upper arm bone, follows, and thus the attachment of the pec will follow. So basically what that means, if you think about it, is that you've got a broomstick, you've got a string attached to the broomstick, and as you lift up the broomstick up into the sky, that string is going to get pulled up with it. And that's effectively the attachment of your pec there. So there is additional lengthening available of the pec as you allow those shoulders to move up as you do the exercise. So what I tend to do, and it depends, to be honest, on the client, but what I'll generally advise people to do is perform the exercise and let your shoulders kind of move with what feels most comfortable. Because what you'll often find is that people will naturally kind of shrug up a little bit as they do the exercise, and then they'll shove the shoulders down at the top of the exercise again as they move to the top of the concentric. So that's what I would generally advise. And I think that's probably the best way of doing them. I'm not sure is that something that you normally do, or what would be your thoughts on that?
I honestly, when I do dips, I don't really think about keeping the scapula still.
Yeah.
But it might be because I'm at the point where I don't really think about the splitting the movements in different parts of the body. I just go through the movements and through the pattern. So it might be different from the way I explain it to someone who's doing his first dips, rather than how I do it myself.
Yeah, and I mean, if I that's a really good point, because if I had a new client, let's say, and they were all over the place on dips, they couldn't coordinate it, it might actually be beneficial at the beginning to say, right, let's actually keep the shoulder blades in one position, and let's just try and get you moving through that movement, so that you're not swinging around as much, for example. So it definitely depends on who you're dealing with. And I think, like you said, when I'm doing them, I generally wouldn't think about it too much, but I definitely used to when I was younger, just be more like, oh, keep the scapula in place. So that would be my thoughts on that. Generally, when it comes to dips and grip, I don't change narrow or wide grip depending on the muscle that's being worked, to be honest, because I think the idea of going really wide on dips, I just don't think it's suitable for most people. I think even when you start to load it up, it just becomes quite uncomfortable. You're a bit more restricted in terms of the range of motion that's available, because the wider you get, effectively, it becomes more of an abduction movement than a shoulder extension movement. Because if you've got your arms really out wide, then they're not extending behind you, they're kind of moving up into this awkward internally rotated position. So that's not necessarily a bad thing. And I think, there'll be a change in terms of the recruitment pattern, let's say. It will be harder at the bottom for the chest probably, but I think generally, as you begin to load that up, I think probably discomfort at the shoulder might become a limiting factor first. That's obviously not the case for everyone. It totally depends. But yeah, I generally don't advise that. What I would normally do with dips is aim to, if you can get those converging dip handles, the dips, so that it's like a V, like that. I think that's the best way of doing dips. If you face in towards the kind of top of the pyramid, you could say, the top of the triangle, I think that's the best way of doing dips, because your shoulders you're not just stuck in, because when you're stuck in, it's kind of like just pure shoulder flexion. I don't think you get as much out of that. Whereas if you've got the arms out slightly, you kind of get the best of both worlds, I think. In terms of torso angle, I'm not entirely sure. I used to think that probably mattered more, but because a lot of the time we do weighted dips, I think that actually ends up governing the torso position anyway. If you use chains around your neck, that obviously changes the position because you've got more weight in front of the axis, you could say. So that kind of naturally leads you to lean forward a bit more, which makes it a bit more of a bench press type movement. Whereas if you're more upright, then there's more, it's a different plane of movement, probably more lower pec involved in that. But yeah, I don't, to be honest, program tricep versus chest dips, because I don't think the difference between different ways of doing dips is significant enough to justify that, really. So if I was trying to get someone to do more chest or tricep work, I'd probably choose more of an isolation exercise, because I think sometimes what happens is our own experience kind of colors what we prescribe to others. Because I used to think that oh, do dips like this for triceps or like this for chest, but then when you actually work with specific clients, they're like, I just feel this in my shoulders, I don't feel this in my chest at all, or I just feel this in my chest, I don't feel this in my triceps. And feeling shouldn't guide everything, but it's certainly a part of the equation, you know.
Absolutely. The other one is about pulling movements. Specifically, I think like when you do, and I want to know your opinion on this, if you do an underhand lat pull down, there are some people that just go overhead in 180 degrees shoulder flexion.
Yeah.
And on myself, over time, I figured that it was just uncomfortable. Yeah. And I started keeping my torso a little bit leaning backward, and to not go at 110, 180, and maybe 150 or something like that. Whether when I do it overhand or neutral, I feel like I'm more in a position to go exactly overhead. Does that make sense?
Yeah, 100%. And I think that's actually something I discussed in one of the anatomy lectures on the shoulder. Basically, what happens is, the more as you move your shoulder into full flexion, so for people at home, it's when your arm is overhead. If you reach overhead, you'll notice that your arm or your elbow pit, which is what I call it, or your bicep, if you look at the position of your bicep, it kind of faces in towards your head. And if you try to make that bicep face backwards so that the pointy part of your elbow, the olecranon process, trying to make that point forward is really hard. It's really difficult because your shoulder just naturally kind of internally rotates as you move overhead. So what ends up happening when you do a pull down, if you try to force yourself into that supinated position in 180 degrees of flexion, the range of motion just isn't there. Like, it's not available because you're not moving into that internally rotated position, because supination basically demands that you externally rotate your shoulder more up in that top position. And if that's not there, that's not there. So what ends up happening then is you force yourself into the position, and then there's more torque acting on the shoulder and acting on the elbows and the wrists that isn't really helping with your lat development at all. So what I say for people who are, doing pull downs is the best thing you can do for, especially in that type of shoulder width grip or just inside it, use a neutral grip or freely moving handles, or somewhere in between. You can get like semi-supinated, which is fine. They're always the best grips, I think, because you're not going to be limited by that shoulder range of motion or by the amount of supination range of motion you got available at the radioulnar joint. So yeah, your experience is definitely something that is mirrored in many people.
Okay. And last one is about lateral raises. So in the coaching corner, you you explained the scapular plane and how it makes sense to work in that position, which for people who don't know is a little bit with the arms a little bit forward, like 30 degrees. So one question that people ask is I think that people actually mess up scapular position while doing side laterals. They try to keep it down when you went for like 30 minutes explaining the humeral scapular rhythm, and that made me think, okay, there is a certain way of things to move. We shouldn't be forcing anything when we do that motion. So yeah. Two questions, sorry. So the first would be, how high would you go? Because some people say if we go past 90, the side delts are not working anymore, and it's mostly traps. And I want to know, because the traps are three actually, and they do different functions. So if you could go on that.
No problem. So yeah, first things first, regarding scapular position, I used to be one of those people who, like, even 3 years ago probably, I used to think that keeping the scapula pinned down and back like religiously on your lateral raises, that was the best way of doing things, and that's fine. Like, you can really light up your delts doing that. But I think in terms of like coaching it, one, if it's unnecessary, there's kind of no point doing it, and two, if you're talking about, like, if you're going to call it a natural movement, the shoulder naturally moves in a different way to that, in that the scapula normally is going to elevate and to rotate as you move up towards 90 degrees and beyond. So I think just allowing for that movement is absolutely fine. And particularly if that's particularly the case if you're having shoulder discomfort, because I used to find that where at some points in time, maybe I might have a bit of shoulder pain and I would never let my scapula move. Whereas if I was actually if I do let them move, it changes the forces, it changes the space within the shoulder joint, and that can be more comfortable as a result. So I don't think either way is necessarily harmful, but I think that not being dogmatic about either way is useful. Sometimes I'll still say to people, instead of shrugging up so high at the top, maybe just a slight little shrug, keep it controlled. Because you do see people who completely swing and just shrug it all the way up, which probably isn't helpful either. So that's the first thing. Yeah, I think allowing the scapula to move a bit is probably good practice. And the other thing then, how high should you come up? I used to think that, coming any higher than 90 isn't a great idea, but that was again because I was keeping the scapula down. Whereas if you allow the scapula to raise up a little bit, you can come up above 90 and it should feel fine. It shouldn't cause you any injury or anything like that. But like you say, you are bringing in the traps a little bit more. But that's fine. That's normal. That's not a big deal. I don't think you need to worry about taking the traps out of the movement. In some cases, they might become the limiting factor because you might feel too much of a burn there. But that's often not the case, and none of us have traps that are too big either. So
it's the same thing I say.
The traps basically, the upper traps anyway, the way they pull on the scapula, they'll pull them up into that rotated position and they'll elevate them a bit. So that's why you feel them more when you get up to that 90 degrees and beyond of shoulder abduction. But with that said, people also say that the side delts are also as short as they will get at 90 degrees, which isn't necessarily true because while the scapula does begin contributing more to movement as you go above 90 degrees, the glenohumeral joint, which is the main shoulder joint, that does still continue moving. So it moves less the higher you get, but it does definitely continue moving. So yeah, as that moves, those side delts do actually shorten a little bit more. And the way I kind of get people to feel that normally is if they lean forward a little bit and then you reach up overhead into that lateral raised position. If you keep going beyond 90, especially in that kind of out in front of the body slightly position, you'll feel your shoulders start to shorten a lot more. So I'm not saying that you necessarily need to get every muscle into the shortest position possible, but from a specific anatomical question, it will shorten a bit more than just at 90 degrees.
Okay, fantastic. So I think that's a good way to wrap things up. So again, thanks a lot for your time. I know how busy you are, and I really do appreciate you taking the time for this. And finally, I would just like to give you time for people that want to reach out for you. The Coaching Corner is definitely a resource that I would have suggested anyway people to sign up for, but I think you're the best guy to do that. And anything specific to your online business and if you feel like sharing.
Perfect. Thank you, Marco. So yeah, as you said, the Coach's Corner is the main platform for people who are trying to kind of move forward as trainers, at least as interested trainees. So if you're someone who, like, you were listening to those last few questions with the anatomical stuff and you're thinking, oh God, I'd love to get that, I'd love to understand that a little bit deeper, that's all the type of stuff that we discuss in the Coach's Corner in specific lectures. And that's basically building and accumulating every week. So if you join the Coach's Corner, you'll constantly be getting access to new content that we are producing and publishing in there. So yeah, you can join that. I might send the link to Marco, or even just go to our website, TriageMethod.com. You'll find it there. Obviously, we also do coaching, as I said. So if you're interested in our coaching services or anything, I have spaces available. If you'd like to work with me, you can just contact me. But if you just like to find me at SkinnyGaz on Instagram, email me at gary@TriageMethod.com, or even just join our Facebook group, the Triage Method community, and you can start to follow along there. But yeah, follow at Triage Method or at SkinnyGaz, and you'll keep up with everything that we're doing over at Triage. So thank you.
Amazing. So that's it for today. Thanks again, Gary. See you next time.